from our study of the book of Acts. And very often what he would find in every city was a band of people that had organized themselves together and that had created a clandestine conspiracy to take him out, simply because he was trying to preach the truth of the gospel. But even under that type of relentless assault, Paul was still able to see the good hand of God and to see God's grace compelling him along through life, and to see the Lord discharging through him something of eternal significance and value as he shared the gospel with as many people as he possibly could. So we come to this text in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It's probably the book of 2 Corinthians is the book where Paul, he reveals more about himself, his own fears, his own doubts, his own uncertainties. That he was not some type of spiritual superman, did not have worry and doubts, feared for his own life at times, wondered whether or not he would be assassinated or what have you. He reveals a lot of that in the book of 2 Corinthians. And so in 2 Corinthians 12, a very powerful passage that I read in your hearing, Paul is now recounting the most ecstatic, the most euphoric experience he'd ever had in his life. And it was so powerful, it was so moving that he wasn't even sure as to whether he was dead or alive when it occurred. And so he talks about this vision, this revelation, this apocalypsis, this unveiling that he had experienced, and no other person have recorded such an experience as Paul had. So he described himself almost in third person in verse 2 of chapter 12. Paul says, I know a man in Christ about 14 years ago. Paul says, I don't know whether he was in the body, whether I was alive, and I had a dream or a vision, or I had an out-of-body experience. Paul says, I really don't know. It was so incredible. It was so amazing. It was so life-changing. I'm not really sure what state that I was in, but I know that it happened. He said, only God knows. And Paul says, I was caught up into the third heaven, and the third heaven is the abode of God. It is the presence of God. We have the atmospheric heaven. We have the stellar heaven where the stars are, and then we have the very third heaven, the very presence of God. And Paul says, I was caught up into the third heaven, into the very presence of God. He says, I know this happened, but I don't know whether I was in the body or I was out of the body. And Paul said, I was in paradise. I was in the land of the departed righteous, who were in the presence of God. And Paul said, in God's presence, I heard things that are inexpressible. Paul says, I heard things that would reflected the glory of God and the transcendent holiness of God. I heard utterances that are inexpressible. I can't articulate them, nor could the human ear entertain them. It was so ecstatic. It was so euphoric, Paul says. And Paul says, having had such an experience, I basically have been sworn to silence, that I can't even speak about it. He says, I can't even speak about it. Of such one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast except in my infirmities. And Paul says, so I'm not going to boast in myself, but I will boast in the fact that there was an experience that was had that's beyond description. He goes on in verse 6 to say, for though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool. I will speak the truth. I forbear lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. So what Paul says is, I did not use this experience to add it to my spiritual credentials, to make me appear to be such a spiritual superstar so I could go from town to town, place to place, boasting about the experience that I had had that no other human being, to his knowledge, had had. So Paul says this very experience itself, it distinguishes me from the entire rest of the Christian community. That I have had an experience that no other person can testify to have had. And he says, so what could happen if I talk about it, Paul says, if I boast about it, Paul says, then the people that I boast to might have a tendency to think more highly of me than what they ought to think. They might want to lift me up, Paul said, and put me on a spiritual pedestal, therefore thinking that I'm some kind of way a spiritual prima donna and that I transcend the problems of this life. Are y'all listening to me? Paul says, I don't want anybody to ever think that I transcend. We've heard a lot about this transcendence in recent days, right? That certain individuals are supposed to transcend race. Well, the Skip Gates situation showed that you don't transcend certain things. There are no transcendent individuals. We're all human beings. We're all men and women with feet of clay, with lips of clay. We would do things we shouldn't do, say things we shouldn't say. You come at me the wrong way, you're liable to get cursed out. I have to be real careful. We all are human beings. And Paul says, I don't want you to think more highly of me than what you ought to think. Paul says, I don't want you to, just because you hear me articulate deep spiritual truths. Paul wrote voluminous letters. Many are recorded in the New Testament. He was a theologian among theologians. And so it would be easy for people to think, well, Paul has now elevated himself above the human experience, and he no longer deals with the mundane problems the rest of us have to deal with. It just isn't so. And we see this revealed as with people that we look at. We have a tendency to want to elevate folk and think that somebody, some kind of way, they are able to ascend above the problems of life. I've shared this with you before, and I remember watching a movie. And the lady on the movie, these were her words. I'll never forget the words. Basically what she says, people want to put people up on pedestals. They want somebody to look up to. And so what they will do, they will elevate people and put people up on pedestals. And then once they put them up on the pedestal, they turn around and they will criticize the very person they elevated because they got a crook in their neck from looking up. That's the way it is. So Paul says, I don't want you to think more highly of me than what you ought to think. I'm a human being dealing with the human experience, with the trials, with the tests, with the frustration, with the hurts, with the pain, with the disappointments, and the sense of my own utter helplessness and hopelessness and despair, even at times. But then Paul goes on to say, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. And so what Paul says, what God did in my life, he changed my exaltation into humiliation. Paul says the thing that I could have used to exalt myself and to declare myself as one who is spiritually transcendent to the other side and who is no longer subjected to the daily routine of hurt and pain and problems as the rest of mere mortals, that very thing that could have exalted me, God used it to humiliate me. Why? Reasons for Paul's propensity to be exalted. First of all was his excellent preparation. See, Paul was unique. He wasn't like everybody else. He was unique. He had unique preparation. He had been trained theologically by the greatest theological mind of the early world, of the first century. A man by the name of Gamaliel had been Paul's personal teacher, his personal instructor. Paul's family was a family of some resources, of some wealth. Paul was born a free Roman citizen in Tarsus. He wasn't born a slave, nor was he born a servant. He was born as a free citizen of Tarsus. And his father had sent him to Jerusalem to be educated by Gamaliel. And so his preparation, his training, he was an aristocrat. He was an intellectual. He was a part of the elite people in Israel. Before he was 30 years of age, he had ascended to being one of the most powerful men in Israel. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the ruling class of 71, who ruled over Jewish affairs. He was a trained litigator as a lawyer, as a Pharisee. He was also trained as a theologian. So his mere excellent, superior preparation would have been a reason for him to think more highly of himself than what he ought to think. His intellectual acumen, his intellectual ability was superior. As a matter of fact, when he's quoting his spiritual pedigree in Philippians chapter 3, he said, I excelled in in the Jewish religion. I excelled in Judaism far